Our left-right political paradigm does not map neatly onto ancient institutions. And there's one institution in our civilization that is the most ancient and ever new, as St. Augustine calls it. The church really resists this kind of compartmentalization.
Well, it's Tuesday morning here in Washington, and the world is still digesting news of Pope Francis's passing some 24 hours earlier. I say this earnestly. The most compelling take on Francis's death I've read yet was published by my colleagues at Unheard, authored by a pseudonymous priest with the pen name Thomas of Chelano. With the headline, The Mystery of Pope Francis, Thomas's essay begins by describing Francis as, quote, probably the most extraordinary man to ever sit on the chair of St. Peter. That is a stunning statement for what it's worth, and if you buy it, adds an incredible gravity to this already very serious moment and to this current period of reflection and planning for the world's now 1.4 billion Catholics. After serving 12 years of Francis's papacy, Thomas of Chelano landed on an interesting conclusion. Quote, in the end, though, little substantive was achieved, he wrote. Quote, the Vatican finances remain a mess, its income falling steadily over his papacy. The Holy See has still not shown clear leadership around sexual abuse, even if it has started in the lower rungs of the church. Ordinary clergy are demoralized and bewildered, and the numbers coming forward to be ordained have declined dramatically. As for changing doctrine or even changing practice, little has happened. Perhaps there's no new model Catholicism in the offing, for the simple reason that none is possible. Michael Knowles, one of my very favorite Catholic thinkers, as a non-Catholic, I'm a Protestant, posted a possible explanation for this point from Thomas of Chelano on X after Francis's passing. Quote, among the chief lessons of Pope Francis's pontificate is that the modern left-right political paradigm does not map neatly onto pre-modern institutions, including and especially our civilization's most ancient and paradoxically ever new institution, the Bride of Christ. R.I.P. I had an opportunity to sit down on Monday night with Michael as he was still digesting the news of Francis's passing. So, without further ado, here's Michael Knowles, host of The Michael Knowles Show on the Daily Wire on Undercurrents. Well, recession concerns are making headlines again, and experts, of course, are paying attention. Jim Walker, the economist who predicted the 2008 market crash, recently said he'd be amazed if a recession can be avoided. For those in or nearing retirement, this economic uncertainty is a real concern, very real. When the dollar declines and markets become volatile, traditional retirement strategies can be exposed, unfortunately. That's why more people are exploring gold IRAs. It's a way to include physical gold in your retirement portfolio. Historically, gold has maintained its value during recessions and periods of inflation, offering a potential hedge against economic downturns. This video is proudly sponsored by Augusta Precious Metals, who've put together a free gold IRA guide to help you understand how it works, why it matters, and whether it's the right fit for you and your financial goals. Gold IRAs are specifically for funds that are already held in a qualified retirement account like an IRA or a 401k. Big thanks to Augusta Precious Metals for supporting this video and for making this resource available for free. If gold is piquing your interest, you can download your free guide by clicking the link below. I want to start, Michael, by asking just what your reaction was when you heard news of Pope Francis's passing.
You know, I found out this morning because I've been in a little bit of a whirlwind. It's Easter, obviously, which is pertinent to the timing of the Pope's death. And I had just taken my family from visiting my grandmother down in Florida. I dragged them all up to D.C. because we were invited to the White House Easter egg hunt. I said, that was a great experience for my kids. So as part of this, I got to go get the tickets at the White House at 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm walking down, bleary-eyed, walk to the White House, and I see this news pop up on my phone. Emily, I take no time off of work. I do my show basically every day. I thought the one morning that I take off from work, the international news, goes crazy like this. And I also, I kid you not, my first reaction, because I was walking right by the White House, and I thought, wow, this is one of those moments like Trump when he heard that Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. It's the first I'm hearing of it. Hold me closer, tiny dancer. So, I certainly don't mean to make light of it, but we all knew that this was coming. And I think there's probably a special consolation if you're a prelate to die if you're a Christian period, to die during Easter week. It ties in with the American political scene in that one of the very last things that Pope Francis did was meet with J.D. Vance. And then, he gave his Urbi et Orbi a blessing. And that was it. He said goodbye to everybody. I was trying to process it, especially as a conservative Catholic, because
Right.
I don't want to sugarcoat it and pretend that there were no questions or even dubia raised during Francis's pontificate. I mean, there were formal questions raised, even amounting to questions about heresy, though often those were downplayed by saying that the Holy Father was just being misrepresented in the media. And I thought, with my head in politics 25 hours a day, I thought the biggest takeaway for me from Francis's pontificate is that our left right political paradigm does not map neatly onto ancient institutions. And there's one institution in our civilization that is the most ancient and ever new, as St. Augustine calls it. And that really resists the church really resists this kind of compartmentalization, because on the one hand, you'll say Pope Francis is a leftist. He advocates open borders or something like that. On the other hand, you'll point out that Pope Francis called gay marriage a machination of the father of lies that seeks to deceive and confuse the children of God. On the one hand, he seemed to suggest that the church needs to be more open and accompanying of people from LGBTism. On the other hand, he said God can't bless sin, and he observed that transgenderism is ridiculous. He called abortion similar to hiring an assassin.
Hmm.
So how do we place him? Is he extremely conservative? Is he extremely liberal? Is he some? Really, I think that the church, even as popes come and go and change and emphasize different things, the church will not fit into your modern political analysis, no matter how hard you try to fit it in there.
And Francis, in particular, embodies that, unlike almost anyone else, for all of the reasons you just outlined. I want to ask about actually something we published in Unheard. I was surprised by the first line of this piece that we ran at Unheard, calling Pope Francis the most extraordinary figure in the history of the papacy. And this is how the author assessed the papacy of Francis. In the end, though, little substantive was achieved. As for changing doctrine, or even changing practice, little has happened. Perhaps there is no new model Catholicism in the offing, for the simple reason that none is possible. Now, that last line goes much broader. If we stay narrowly on the question of Francis, he came in at a moment when there was a lot of hope for change. And that he would be a change agent, he would be a positive change agent in an institution that should remain largely unchanged, Michael. So he leaves it. In what state, per your assessment?
Well, Emily, I have to ask, was there much hope for change or dread of change? I
Right.
suppose it
Right.
depends
The
on your
media
view
was
of the
very
church.
hopeful. Yes.
The media were very hopeful that
Yes.
a new pope would come in and basically abolish the church, and they're disappointed that hasn't
True.
happened.
Although we
Uh,
should
you
also
know,
say there were structural changes that I think some people were optimistic. Sexual abuse, for example, or finances.
sure,
There
sure.
were some structural, I guess, reasons some people were like, oh, we're turning a new page.
The irony, of course, about the sexual abuse scandal is one, the media focused on the Catholic Church's sexual abuse scandal, totally ignored sexual abuse scandals in other walks of life, including liberal walks of life,
Yeah.
such as public schools, which have sexual abuse at roughly twice the rate that we ever saw in the Catholic Church. Not to downplay anything, just to point out that the media are selectively outraged. And then when you mention the Vatican's finances, that actually ties in with the sexual abuse scandals of 20 years ago, 30 years ago, really, because everyone thinks that the scandals involve sex.
Hmm.
In fact, the deeper scandals probably involve money, as is often the case.
Hmm.
Fair enough, the Vatican Bank still has lots of questions about it. And I think the conclusion is right about Pope Francis. Not very much did change. From my standpoint, I'm a layperson. A lot of these questions go far above my head. I'm not a prelate. One thing I really care about is the traditional Latin Mass, which has attracted a lot of young people to revert and convert to the faith. You saw record conversions in France on Easter Sunday. You're seeing Catholics now outnumbering practicing Anglicans in the UK, which is pretty beautiful. And a lot of that has been tradition, the liturgy, orthodoxy, smells and bells. Not returning to the way that the church has saved souls for many centuries, not some of the innovations of the 1970s with the sappy, ridiculous hymns and the electric guitars. So, there were restrictions placed on the Latin Mass under Pope Francis, But there was hope among the liberals. There was a lot of fear among conservatives that Pope Francis would eliminate the Latin Mass. That hasn't happened.
Mm.
And frankly, we're a religion of the catacombs, and I think the traditional liturgy has actually thrived because of that. I have to be very grateful to Pope Francis. My reversion occurred under his pontificate mostly, and I think that's true for a lot of people. So when we talk about the springtime of the church, even if it's among all of those rigid traditionalists whom many at the Vatican don't like, paradoxically, it occurred under Francis's pontificate. To the claim that Francis was the singular figure in the history of the church or something. That's just preposterous.
Mm-hmm.
He had an interesting papacy. There was much good that was done. There were some questions that remain, certain things that I wouldn't have done if I were pope, but nobody ever elected me. But what I think that speaks to is just a popular ignorance, to put it bluntly, of the church. The church does not measure her years in decades. She measures them in centuries and millennia. So even many conservatives who are not Catholic, the oldest, most traditional pope they can point to is John Paul II. John Paul II, a great man, a canonized saint. But the church goes back a little further. I think Blessed Pius IX might qualify as a bolder and more consequential pope. He did dogmatically define teachings. Pope Leo XIII really articulating and codifying Catholic social teaching, which would come up again in Pope John Paul II's teaching, and really helped be a counterweight to communism in the 20th century. Going back further, Urban II, I think the Crusades were a pretty big deal. Gregory the Great, that would probably count. So no, and this should be maybe a consolation to the conservatives and traditionalists, and probably is annoying to the liberals who hoped for so much more out of Francis's pontificate. But I don't think it was a particularly consequential pontificate. There have been many, many popes, and it's probably a good thing that a single pontificate can't be all that consequential. I think that is just part and parcel of the sheer weight of Holy Mother Church, which, as we were discussing earlier, is both the one ancient institution in our civilization that has endured to the present day, and yet appears to be ever new, an observation of St. Augustine that continues to be true today.
Yeah, and your point on X that you just fleshed out here a bit about how difficult it is to map modern political divides onto ancient institutions is so interesting in the context of what comes next, and Francis's own tensions with the church in Africa, with the church in places where it's really growing, and it's actually growing conservative strains that, interestingly enough, clash with the quote-unquote progressives at the Vatican. And I'm curious, to what extent you think the remnant of Francis's ideology exists now as they convene the conclave. How likely is it that a progressive steps in? How much would it sort of maybe miss the moment from your perspective if that's what happens? Where do you see this going?
Well, again, I would be very careful in trying to define Pope Francis's ideology. Generally, Catholics try to avoid ideology because ideology is a kind of modern reduction of a grand tradition. And however, there are plenty of ideologues in the church, so I'm not denying that. I just think that Pope Francis, whenever you think you can nail him down ideologically, you find yourself in trouble. So, to your point on cardinals that he is consecrated in Africa or in Latin America, one would think at this point, over 12 years into Francis's pontificate, okay, the College of Cardinals is stacked. The younger cardinals, who are more likely to be the cardinal electors in a papal conclave, stacked by Francis's men. So we're going to have Francis 2.0 for the next pope. I don't think that's really how it works. One example I would point to is in Africa, when Pope Francis issued Fiducia Supplicans, which sought to, or rather was understood to loosen up Catholic pastoral teaching on practicing homosexuals. The African bishops just said no. And they came out and they said, no, no thanks.
It's like Michael Scott,
we're going
I
to keep
send it
doing
back.
what we've been doing.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the Vatican did not really press them on it. A lot of the supposedly progressive cardinals who have been consecrated are surprisingly conservative for being progressives. And so, Pope Francis, I mean this word not in a disparaging way. he appointed or consecrated cardinals and created cardinals in a kind of a weird way. Places that you wouldn't expect to have a cardinal got a cardinal. Places that certainly should have a cardinal didn't get a cardinal, and so we don't really know. When I look at the papabili, the likely candidates in the upcoming papal conclave, I don't see a ton of progressives or radicals or liberals. I mean, there are some. Cardinal Matteo Zuppi would probably be one of them. Cardinal Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State. There are a few others who would seem to be a little bit more left wing, and by that I mean, in the church
Right,
sense,
right.
more hostile to tradition, and we'll leave it there. One could say further things, but I don't want to speak ill of a cardinal too soon. I think there are also moderates to conservatives. You look at Cardinal Peter Erdo in Hungary. He's uh, certainly center right and has spoken in a more traditionally Catholic way about issues like immigration, to say nothing of abortion and marriage and gender and all the rest of it. I think Cardinal Pizzaballa in what a wonderful name
Yeah.
in Jerusalem. He's the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. That would be a really timely election for Pope, as the Israel-Gaza conflict has really sucked a lot of the oxygen out of the room in terms of geopolitics. To have the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, who again you can't totally nail down on his politics, who has spoken in defense of Palestinian Arabs and Christians in particular, who does not appear to be particularly hostile to Israel or something like that. Just that one narrow geopolitical issue, kind of interesting, and a lot of the papabili. I mean, we hear about wonderful cardinals like Cardinal Robert Sarah in Africa, who is much more traditional, very open to the traditional Latin Mass. There's an American cardinal, Cardinal Raymond Burke, who is just a wonderful man, also sympathetic to the church and her tradition and the traditional liturgy. Uh, the odds of someone like a Cardinal Burke or a Cardinal Sarah becoming the next pope are relatively low. We don't, where there's life, there's hope, but they're advanced in age. Some of the other contenders, though, I feel pretty good about. There are only a handful that I think are really landmines that Mother Church should avoid stepping onto.
Well, last question, Michael, is just it feels right now like a lot of souls are ripe for the harvest. And I say that not as an evangelical, not as a Catholic, but I think we're seeing the fruits of this very much so. As you mentioned, France, the resurgence of the Latin Mass, and also the new challenges of technology that have been with us for a long time, but also feel as though they're accelerating. So, as you look at the next papacy, what do you feel like is on the line? I mean, obviously, souls are on the line. That's the most obvious answer to that question in the world. But culturally and technologically, what do you think is on the line right now in this moment?
I hope that the next pope speaks with clarity, because clarity is charity. So on issues such as immigration, which is a top issue for everyone in the West, and this is reflected in even political opinion polls, the church, I hope, will articulate her traditional stance on immigration, which might not perfectly please people on the left or the right, but which is a little bit more nuanced than just throw open the borders and give money to Catholic bishops' charities, through your taxpayer dollars to import third world criminals, which is something that we hope does not occur anymore.
It's been a fun
So
experiment.
just on that issue, on gender, a little clarity, marriage, a little clarity. Again, the Catholic Church has been clearer and more consistent than any institution in the West. It's probably the singular institution that has really held the line and held true to her teaching on contraception, marriage, gender, all the rest. But a little more clarity would be good on those issues as well. But I don't want to sound like a broken record. A focus on reverent liturgy would be wonderful. If I were asked and I were to offer one request to the cardinals and to the next pope, it would be loosen up the restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass.
Hmm.
A lot of people think the traditional Latin Mass is just the Mass that we have today, but in Latin.
Hmm.
That's not true. The Mass that endured in substantially its same form from the Gregory the Great from 600 AD all the way up until after the Second Vatican Council, that Mass had more prayers. It was different in its liturgy. I think it is more reverent. One can have a reverent new Mass, the Mass of Pope Paul VI. It can be done. I'm not saying it's impossible to have a reverent Mass, but in practice, it tends to be given more to irreverence. And I think that the people who are converting, maybe not directly because of the traditional Latin Mass, but because of that reverence. There's an old Catholic understanding: lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi. The law of worship is the law of belief, is the law of life. So if I pray on my knees, if I have beautiful churches that kind of raise my mind to heaven, if I receive our Lord in the Holy Eucharist on the tongue while I'm kneeling, rather than just kind of casually walking up in line, taking my unconsecrated hands, receiving what I am supposed to believe is the body and blood, soul, and divinity of my Lord Jesus Christ in my hands, where crumbs might fall. These seem like trivia to a lot of people. They seem over who really cares, but well, the consequence is who really cares. I mean, now you have something like only 30% of American Catholics believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Why is that? I think their belief has changed, in part because the way that they've worshipped has changed. And so I would say, look, I don't go to Mass on Sunday to get more of what I see everywhere in the world Monday through Saturday. Okay. I go to Mass because it is my obligation, because God asks it of me, and I ought to worship God. And the purpose of life is to know God, to serve him in this world, and to enjoy him forever in heaven. But I also go there because I want a little glimpse of heaven beforehand. I get enough of the quotidian life and pop culture and a bunch of nonsense every other day of the week. It reminds me of that old bit from King of the Hill, the cartoon, which is Hank Hill was inveighing against Christian rock music. And he says, it doesn't make Christianity any better. It just makes rock worse. And I think he's right about that. So anyway, if any cardinals are listening out there, if any future popes are listening, I think that would be really, really helpful. The people don't want to go to church to hear some leftist political lecture. They don't go to church just to say hello to their friends. It's nice to see your neighbors or whatever. We don't go to church to hear really cool modern music. We're going to church to pray. Okay. And God is very clear in the Old Testament and in the New Testament that certain ways of worship are more conducive to reverence and to our own flourishing than others. And so, since the Second Vatican Council, the cardinals and the bishops have asked, how do we bring the youth back into the church? Oh, I'll tell you, man, the median age at my traditional parish is like 8, because I all have so many kids. And even among the adults, really, the median age is probably 28 or 30. The people are clear. If we want a real aggiornamento, a real update, if we want real accompaniment, if we want really to meet people where they are, we want more active participation, then give us what Catholics have enjoyed and been edified by for 2,000 years. Give us that good old religion.
The boomers never saw it coming. Michael Knowles, thank you so much for your time on this very busy day. We appreciate it.
Great to be with you as always. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for watching. We appreciate it. Make sure to subscribe wherever you download your podcast, subscribe on YouTube. And if you want a premium version of the show, we actually have a community over at undercurrents.tv. You can sign up and get all kinds of access, premium episodes every week, a weekly newsletter from me, and an email address where you can connect with us directly. So good to have Michael here, and it was so helpful as the conversation naturally falls into this left-right paradigm. You could hear it even in our conversation. It's almost impossible to avoid falling into, because if you take a figure like Francis, he does, and he did, end up in the media conversation so prominently being featured as leaning into progressive cultural stances. But to Michael's point, it doesn't take away from his stances on marriage or on abortion, for example. And in some cases, that's because the media picks up the sort of progressive stances and, makes them a sort of bigger story than the others. With Francis, they really sought to place him in this role within this narrative of a reformer and a progressive in quite an interesting way. He didn't always fit that narrative, and it seemed like they would downplay it when that was the case. And so to have Michael, I think, remind us that these paradigms don't map onto institutions like the church and don't map onto institutions like Francis himself, who is, not he's sort of a product of Argentinian politics, which is kind of interesting as well, like mid-century Argentinian politics, post-war Argentinian politics, and has been accused of being sort of a Peronist, and has never, I mean, coming from that world, was always going to be very hard to map onto left or right, uniquely difficult to map onto left or right as far as modern popes go. But it's very easy to fall into these I guess, paradigms or these categories, these binaries is probably the best way to put it. So I thought it was very useful to have Michael bring us back up to the 30,000 foot level from the media fray and from that sort of very narrow discourse to a much better contextualization of Francis's legacy, and the church as it stands right now in April of 2025. So thank you for tuning in, and we will be back here with more Undercurrents soon.